next EOS talk, we have Robbie Allen. He's the CEO and founder of Automated Insights, and his talk will focus on sports journalism and disruption of analytics and regarding sports journalism and whether the next Bill Simmons will be made of software. So please welcome Robbie Allen. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, I'm super excited to be here today. I've been attending these conferences, I think, since the second one, when it was at the Status Center at MIT, and so to see the growth has been pretty interesting. And so today I'm going to talk about something that I've been working on for the last couple of years and continues to be a work in progress. First, a little bit about me. I have a background as a writer and a programmer, and the significance of that will become obvious in a few minutes. I am the founder and CEO of Automated Insights, formerly StatSheet Incorporated. Some of you may be familiar with statsheet.com. Over time, we've morphed that into a larger company, that's Automated Insights. I've written several books, mostly technical books that you probably wouldn't care much about, for O'Reilly, A-Press, and Addison Wesley. And I have a background in computer science, as well as a couple of master's degrees from MIT. The other thing that you should know about me is I'm an avid UNC basketball fan. And so this conference always presents a challenge to me because they hold it on the first Saturday of March, and that's always when UNC plays Duke in the final game of the year. And so I have to make the decision, do I fly back early and miss some of the conference or stay an extra night? This year I've decided to stay an extra night, so anybody that wants to go out and watch UNC beat Duke on a Saturday night, feel free to ping me. Okay, so let's get right to the meat of it. Again, just with the growth of this conference, it's been really interesting to see how analytics has permeated a lot of different professions in sports media and how it's changed many of those professions in significant ways. Everybody from the coaches and general managers to scouting, as was made prevalent in Moneyball, and even players, and how we evaluate players, who we consider to be a good player or a value-add player. And yes, I did include a picture of Shane Battier, a former Duke player with a bloody face. That wasn't intentional. But what about sports writers? Again, I've been coming to this conference a while. I think there's one panel or one session that I remember sort of devoted to analytics and sports journalism, but that's been it for the most part. And so, to me, it's curious that one of the more sort of public displays of how we consume our sports information has been largely unaffected by this sort of revolution in analytics. But if you kind of take a step back and think about, all right, what is sports writing? What's going on there? I would contest that upwards of 70% of all sports writing is about analyzing performance in one way or another. Writing about last night's game, describing whether or not LeBron James is having a better season this year. Fundamentally, at the heart of a lot of sports writing is just analyzing performance. Obviously, there's other things like breaking news and trades and rumors and that type of thing. But again, I would contend that a big portion of that is analyzing performance. And so if you think about that and kind of, again, in the Moneyball context, doesn't that sound a little familiar? That's exactly what scouts do. At a fundamental level, they're analyzing player performance. And as Moneyball showed and it's kind of been proven out over the last few years, people aren't necessarily always the best ones to do that type of analysis. There's built-in biases, there's a lack of knowledge of new sort of ways to analyze players, there's a lack of access to data. And so I would contend that sports writers are similar in nature to scouts. All right, so put that aside, that's kind of my one sort of conjecture. The second one, I'll talk a little bit about sports media. I started StatSheet back in 2007. I wanted to do interesting and innovative things with sports stats around visualizations, interesting query tools, and that type of thing, because large sports media companies didn't really use or think of stats as a competitive advantage. Not using them in an innovative way. So anyway, over time, analyzing it, I can sort of grossly generalize sports media companies into two main functions that they provide. One is airing sporting events, whether that's on TV or radio. Obviously, that's a big reason that we follow, the ESPNs of the world and Fox Sports, et cetera. But then the other piece is paying people to write or present content. Again, just kind of at a real generic level, that's what they do. They pay people to write or present content. The problem with that is you're sort of tying the volume of content that's being produced to the amount of money that you're willing to spend to produce it. And so this chart is just a population density map of the United States. And because we sort of have this idea that the content's tied to how much you're willing to pay for it, that means the areas in white, which are the areas that don't have a lot of people, are necessarily going to have less content produced for their areas. Because big sports media companies can't make the ROI work, it doesn't make sense for them to produce content about Idaho when there's not nearly as many people as in Los Angeles. So they would tend to prefer to generate content about those more densely populated areas. Makes lots of sense. But the result of that is a long tail of sports content. And so, you have a big snout, as they call it, where all the major teams and all the major locations have an excess of content. You have more than most fans probably need or have a difficult time navigating. But then you have this long tail of the Elons of the world, of the Idahos of the world, or of the other sort of non-major sports that don't get any coverage in some cases. And again, that's kind of tied back to this notion that if you're stuck paying people to write content, you have to have an ROI on that content. So what if we had a different model? What if we could sort of break that relationship where you weren't necessarily constrained by how much it costs to produce the content? And so imagine with me, if you will, that we can create software that would essentially simulate what a sports writer would do. And so the first question might be, why would you do this? Why would you want to have software to generate content? Well, there's actually a lot of reasons. First of which, and again, I have a background as a writer, so all these really strike home with me as well. Software doesn't get writer's block. It's not like there's sort of hiccups in their productivity. Software can work around the clock. There's no late night deadline that's going to be an issue for software. But getting into more of the meat of it, software can be reprogrammed and improved at a much greater rate than what a person can. So, I'm in my mid-30s. I've done a lot of writing, but it's not likely that my writing is going to get much better throughout the rest of my life. With software, it's something that we can constantly improve over time and make better and better. It doesn't have those sort of constraints as the age of software doesn't necessarily decay its ability to improve its writing. In fact, you can make it better over time. Potentially, one of the biggest attributes of software writing is that it can access and analyze significantly more data. Again, that's one of the biggest benefits because, as a writer, I'm kind of constrained to what I have access to, my computational abilities to, look at the data, analyze the data, and crunch it. But that's exactly what software is good at. And then the last point that may be sort of non-obvious that I think is interesting is that if you think about writing, in a sort of fundamental way, it's a solitary event. Somebody sitting down, writing out a piece of content. Maybe in some of the upper end cases, a writer will have an assistant or somebody that can help with research or, help them, edit the content. With the type of software that we've created that does writing, writing becomes more of a group activity. We can incorporate the knowledge and expertise of multiple people into the software and into the algorithms that determine what was interesting about an event, what is the important analysis to consider. Okay, so, this automated sort of notion it doesn't come for free. There's obviously limitations to it as well. A couple of the big ones first, software is not good at qualitative analysis. Software is great for quantitative analysis. Again, crunching numbers. It's not as good at, describing more of the qualitative features. That's what humans are really good at. And so it'll be very difficult for, again, to use a UNC example, for a piece of software to describe, Chris Webber dragging his foot, which was a phantom, travel that wasn't called, which led to him calling a timeout, which the team didn't have, and resulted in some technical shots that ultimately led UNC to win the national championship. Because a lot of that is not based in data, there's not direct data that you can pull that describes that he drug his foot. Software will not be able to describe that in the same way. But on the opposite side, what I would say is that what the software can do is pull out statistical anomalies and interesting things about the event that a person, again, wouldn't be able to do on their own because they just don't have access to all of that, A, data, and B, computational power. The next limitation is that it is much more of an upfront effort to create automated content. You have to go through the process of developing algorithms that determine what are the key data triggers, as we call them, which are, when X is greater than Y by Z%, that's an interesting event. You have to define all of that. You have to essentially apply semantics to data, and then you have to codify it. And so obviously that is more work than somebody just sitting down writing one article. But again, the benefit is that over time you could generate thousands of articles using that sort of base infrastructure as opposed to the one. And then the last one that I often hear is, well, software is not going to have any personality. That, if a computer's doing the writing, then that probably means the content's going to be stilted. It won't have any personality. And the thing to keep in mind is that, there's somebody behind the software writing the software and writing the algorithms and then the phrases that all get combined together to produce a piece of content. And those people can make the content as opinionated as they want. So we think of it as opinionated software where we can make, our content be biased in one way or another. And in fact, a lot of what we've produced is, when we'll generate a game recap, we don't do it for the game on a whole like you may be accustomed to with the AP. We'll generate a game recap for both teams. So one will take the perspective of the winning team and the other recap will take the perspective of the losing team. And in fact, you could even take it a step further. And so there's a couple of things that we've, dabbled with. This isn't something that, we're, publicly pushing out. But you could even add a certain tone to the content. And so imagine, you could go and select from an article, whether you want sort of the over-the-top personality to kind of come through in the content, or maybe the, more straight down the middle factual personality, or maybe the sort of old crotchety guy personality. And so in the example that I've shown up here, we're using words like, trifectas and PTPer and the all-Windex team. That's representative of Dick Vitale and the sort of phraseology that he's uses on a very regular basis. In fact, ESPN has a whole page dedicated to describing exactly what all of Dickie V's common sayings mean. And so we can take our standard game recap and then imbue it with that type of phraseology that essentially makes it sound as if that person wrote it. So there's not really any limitations on the ability to add personality to a piece of content. All right, so to get down to the examples, we, at StatSheet, I had this notion that I could automate sports writing to a certain degree. So we did a test, and it was a pretty significant test. We wanted to support, all the major sports, and so for each major sport, we created an individual team site, a website. So each team has its own independent domain, and we support college basketball, NFL, Major League Baseball, and NBA. And so you can go to carolinaupdate.com is one example. That's the UNC website that we have. And so we have over 400 websites that are all completely automated. And so if you go to one of them, you'll see charts and graphs and visualizations, but then you also see all of these articles that are up on the site. And all of those articles are completely automated. And again, we've done that in the case of college basketball for all 344 Division I teams. So you can go to the Elon website and you'll get just as detailed information as you would if you go to the Carolina website. I've mainly been talking about what we call long-form narratives, which are 3, 4, 5 paragraphs, which we've spent a lot of time automating. But that's not the only sort of opportunity out there. The other big thing that we've been exploring is more short-form content. And so, for example, last March Madness, we were sitting around thinking, what do college basketball fans like to do? Well, one of the things they like to do, at least I like to do, is talk trash to my friends about their team. The problem is, and even though I know college basketball fairly well, and I'm a big UNC fan, if I'm talking to an Ohio State Buckeye fan, I'm not going to know a lot. I can say that we've won more national championships, but I don't follow their team that much. So what we got to thinking is actually, trash talk is really fundamentally rooted in stats. Why don't we just automate that for people? And so that's exactly what we did. We created an application called StatSmack. If you go to stat-smack.com, you can see it. And we did it for, again, all the major sports that we cover. And you can essentially take any two teams across those sports, and we'll give you 10 to 30 statistical slams that you could say about that team. Now, the great thing about that is, again, we didn't just say, let's just focus on the major teams. We could probably have more rich stats MAC for the big teams, we wanted to do it for every team. So you can go on and compare Elon to Duke. Now that presents some problems because if you're an Elon fan, there's not going to be a lot that you could say to a Duke fan. So we incorporated other sort of non-sporting related smack in there as well. So things like crime rates, graduation rates. So if you go on and Elon, you compare Elon to Duke, it may say, the crime rate in Burlington, North Carolina is significantly better than in Durham, North Carolina. And so be careful when you're visiting the Duke campus. So that's just one kind of example, of the types of things that we can do. Another one is quizzes. So this has kind of been a sort of perpetual issue in the sports world where, there's lots of fans that like to take sports trivia. The challenge for the producer of that app is, coming up with all the different questions, right? I mean, you can do it, it's just very resource intensive. But for us, a quiz question is just another form of content we could automate. So that's exactly what we're in the process of doing, and we should have something launched before March Madness begins. And essentially, we've automated tens of thousands of questions for every team that we cover. It'll be things like, who led the team in scoring last year? The great thing about our system is we can actually also have various difficulty levels by just skewing the potential answers by some number of standard deviations away from the correct answer. So if it's an easy answer, or if it's an easy quiz question, then there'll be a right answer and then maybe two other answers that just have nothing to do with that team. Or if it's a hard question, it could be, and again, it's who led the team in scoring last year. It'll have 4 players that were on the team last year, the top 4 scorers, and you're left to figure out who was the best. The other thing is we've also done we do a lot of metrics. So another form of automated content in my mind is taking data and boiling it down to a number that's representative of a larger data set. And so what we set out to do was create a system that allow us to grade every single player performance across the sports that we cover. So in our box score, what you'll see is, especially if you're looking at a recap, we'll have a table of sort of the top players of that game, and then a letter grade beside what we gave them for that game. And obviously, unlike a lot of grading systems out there, ranking systems, which still kind of blow my mind that they use these sort of non-standard scales, where maybe 80 is this excellent performance. Everybody kind of intuitively understands that the U.S. grading scale, a 95 is an A performance. And so that's what we've based our scales on. And so everybody knows if somebody got a B, then they had a decent performance. If it was an A+, then that means it was excellent. Okay, so the other thing I didn't mention is, so across all of those sites that we created, last year we generated over 500,000 sports stories. So that's everything from game recaps and game previews to players of the week, because again, we're grading out every player's performance. We know over a course of a week who had the best performances, to historical retrospectives like, on this day, some number of years ago, something interesting occurred. One last point I'll make on this is because our software is sort of time independent, it doesn't matter when we get the data, we can generate the recap. Oftentimes what we'll do to test out our software is go back in time and generate content for prior seasons. And so one of the projects that we're working on right now is through RetroSheet and some of that historical MLB data, we can go back all the way to the late 1800s and generate game recaps for every MLB game there's ever been. And so it's pretty cool to read about Babe Ruth hitting a home run and some of the other things that we've seen. Okay, so I'm about done. Just a couple more slides. If you look at this map, and you may not even be able to see it too well, but the red dots are representative of what big sports media considers their, quote, local coverage. And it always kind of makes me laugh a little bit when they talk about their local coverage when it's really major metropolitan coverage. There's really nothing local about it. It's just, they're covering the major areas. And again, for good reason. It's extremely expensive to cover a lot more than that. After 12 months, our coverage is representative of the dots here, where we have, websites and content applications covering a large variety of locations. And in fact, it's kind of funny, this time of year, the college basketball conference tournaments are starting up. We'll start to get emails from athletic directors that are, emailing our Elon editor at raisetheashes.com, I think is the Elon site. And they'll say, hey, we love your coverage of our team. Can we give you tickets to our conference tournament so you can cover that in person? They have no clue that it was all automated content behind the scenes generating all that great coverage they're talking about. They thought it was just some blogger out there that had created a site and was doing recaps and all these articles for their team. And so that always gives us a chuckle, but it kind of illustrates sort of the power of what we're able to do. Okay, so what about Bill? The title of the talk was Automating Bill Simmons. Is that even an option? Again, qualitative writing is hard to emulate. And so Bill does a great job of writing very qualitative pieces that pull from sort of his unique mind around sports and how he thinks about sports and uses various pop culture references. That's much harder to emulate. And in fact, when people say, so is your goal to replace sports writers? In fact, no, it's not. I think of what we're doing is adding to the conversation, not replacing it. It kind of built into that question is this notion, if we could write the perfect piece about a specific event, that means nobody else should write about it, right? We just wrote the perfect piece. And that's not how it works. What happens is we'll have a certain perspective that we can bring to it. Again, it's a very quantitative perspective. And then there's obviously room for other people that maybe want a more qualitative viewpoint. But one thing I will say is that this is a work in progress. We're not automating what Bill Simmons writes today, but a year and a half in, we've generated a large volume of content that I think is pretty high quality. We're starting to do things that would allow us to potentially have more qualitative aspects to the writing. So I wouldn't underestimate the power of automated content and what it could do in the future. Last point that I'll make is I was surprised I was able to make it through this talk. I was in San Jose, California yesterday speaking at the Strata Big Data Conference. It's one of the big conferences around this notion of big data, which is this growing, you can almost think of it as analytics, sports analytics, but applied to a lot of other verticals. And one of the common refrains is, wow, this must be really deep, you're writing deep personal content. It's not very personalized, it's not very back to that personality question. And how I describe it is, instead, what we're doing is humanizing data. So if you put our database of 3 billion stats in front of anybody, they're not going to be able to make heads or tails of it. Or if you put some of the rich, deep data that we calculate based on what happens in play-by-play and some of the other things, a normal user can't make heads or tails of that. And so what we're doing is actually humanizing that data so that people can decipher it and hopefully provide some insight and something that they'll find interesting and entertaining. All right, that's all I have. Happy to take questions. I think lunch is after this, so we can take some questions now if you have any. Thank you.
Hey, thanks. I think this is some pretty awesome stuff.
Thanks.
Can you give us a little bit of idea about the software development and how you proceeded to make the software that does this?
Yeah, so it's interesting, again, my background's in writing and programming. Our content development process looks much more like software development. It's not like your traditional way of opening up a Word doc or what have you and writing out an article. Ours is much more like software development. So we have a team of both writers and developers, and they work hand in hand. And the writers are real kind of more data analysts than anything. And so they're responsible for helping apply those semantics that I talked about earlier, where we need to sort of intuitively know what an RBI means and in what context is that relevant. And so there's this sort of data mapping process that these writers go through, as well as this enumeration process of articulating all the different types of phrases and words that could be used in a particular piece. One of the interesting things about sports is that many people may think that you could just have sort of a base framework for all the different types of things you might say in a story. But the thing that we found is obviously the lexicon, even across sports, varies dramatically. So it's not the case that you can even reuse a lot of that in between sports. The way that people talk about Major League Baseball is a lot different than how they talk about the NBA. I think there was a question up front. Yes?
What do you think about generating content that's like live or almost live as opposed to sort of game summaries?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So sort of the next frontier for us is generating live content. And so one of the things that we're working on, we have one of the article types we do is called game notes. And if you're familiar with the college level athletic program, the athletic directors will generate these pretty interesting game notes after every college and football game that have just interesting one-liners. John Henson recorded 8 blocks. That was a career high for him. Things like that. I looked at that and thought, wow, I can't believe people are manually doing that. That should be automated. And we've gotten a lot of positive feedback on that because that's perfect for a computer to do. Well, the next question we got, well, can we have that sort of live during the game? And so we're working with the UNC radio crew to provide them an interface that shows in real time as it happens these interesting game notes. So typically the way that works is either in radio or TV there's a stat guy or maybe there's a crew in a truck that's sitting there scurrying around trying to come up with and figure out what are the interesting things that have occurred in the game so I could feed that back to the guys that are doing the commentary. Again, all that should be automated, and that's exactly part of sort of the live content that we'll be doing. The other thing that we'll be doing is live quiz questions. So this notion of the second screen environment is becoming really popular. The problem is, presenting people with interesting content while they're watching an event has still the same problems that traditional content development does. It's very costly. What we can do is provide content in a live fashion, either in sort of the game notes or quiz questions, things of that nature that are based on the events that are going on in that game. The other thing is we can generate recaps periodically throughout the game, and we can essentially have a running recap after every quarter, after every half, and generate the recap at that point in time. Should I just? Yeah, okay.
Hello. What are the implications for other types of markets like business, finance, marketing, and promotions, politics?
Yeah. That's another good question. So again, we started off, and I started the company a stat sheet. We've since raised money, and now we've rebranded the company Automated Insights because there's an opportunity to do what we're doing, but also outside of sports. And so we're tackling areas like finance, real estate, traffic. There's actually a whole host of other verticals that are very data rich. In some cases, the quality of the writing is not very high, so the bar is not very high for us to generate something that is passable. And so we're absolutely exploring different areas now. Yes? Oh, okay, sorry.
I'm curious, as more fans get access to more and more games to watch live, whether that be on their phones, on their computers, on their television. You can watch almost any game live now. How does that change the paradigm for you guys as far as what you think the expectations for a recap are? Do fans want things that are even more deep, more storytelling? The analytics are stronger because chances are they can see the game they want and they can get live data during it if they want.
Well, part of the opportunity is that, whether we're talking about the second screen experience or even just the content we generate, even if you've seen the game, we want to provide a value on top of that. So again, our game grades, interesting insights that you're not going to hear on TV because again, they don't have sort of this engine running in the background that can figure out what are all the interesting things that occurred. The bar for us is to make sure that we're providing content that's going to be entertaining that's in addition to what you would already get on TV or anywhere else on the web. Yes? Oh, sorry.
Are you using any standard metadata formats like MPEG-7, SportsML, OWL, anything like that?
Yeah, so we have a data provider that provides all of our current season stats. We've collected historical stats over a number of years. But yeah, we use SportsML actually specifically. But we do rely on a data provider to give us current season, live stats, play-by-play box scores. Yes.
How do you decide what's interesting?
So that's a great question. In the sports space, it's easy for us, meaning my company, because pretty much everybody in the company is a sports fan. And so, we have sort of insight into what we think people would find interesting because we're essentially developing all this for ourselves as well. But again, we also can do, interesting things because it's all automated, we can run tests to see, do people like this type of article versus this type? And what we focused on, and again, I've talked a lot about game recap and preview. To me, those are the least interesting things we do. The things that I find more interesting are like our players of the week or some of the other types of articles that nobody else is producing. And those are the ones that we focus on because if we're just doing game recaps, again, that's going to be of limited value. We want to do articles that nobody else is writing, that are only potentially possible through automation. Okay, I think that's it. I'll be up here and obviously, hear the rest of the conference, so feel free to come up and have a chat.